But I just want to do just a quick introduction of Brian and then get him going with his panel, because we just really got a great cast and Andrew up here to join us. So just let me introduce Brian real quick. Brian's a technical advisor for Secure World Foundation. He's had over 14 years of professional experience in national and international space security area. Just a wealth of knowledge. If any of you have read any of Brian's papers, they're technical, but not too technical, so I can even read them. And I mean, just very, very sound researcher and writer, excellent writer. His expertise has established him as thought leader for providing critical analysis that supports the development of space policy, really on a global scale. Prior to joining the foundation, Brian was an Air Force officer for nearly a decade, working with ICBMs and also working in the JSPOC program, directing the orbital analysis training program, and developed tactics, techniques, and procedures for improving space situational awareness. So someone who's really been in the trenches on the SSA situation for quite some time. Brian also, as technical advisor, conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governments. So with that, it gives him a little credibility to lead this panel. Plus, he's married to a wonderful Canadian Air Force officer who has been the outreach and the conduit to so many of us in the Washington space community and reaching out to the Canadians. Without further ado, Brian Whedon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and keep the pre-discussion chit-chat to a minimum because I know it's the last panel of the day and the beaches and beer and barbecue are probably all calling to all of us. And no, we don't have free iPads for all of you who actually stayed to the end. That was, if there was a rumor going around, that was all just, a false rumor. So we're going to close out today by giving perhaps a bit of a different perspective on this issue from what sort of the theme has been throughout the day. And that is, what is the role or potential role for non-military actors when it comes to SSA? And that, I think, is a very interesting question, and as some of the discussions earlier today have highlighted, a fairly difficult one to try and tackle. SSA, like many space technologies and space activities before it, started out as something that was done as a purely military function by the military for the military. Just like GPS, just like remote sensing, just like a whole handful of other aspects of space. But a recurring theme from today and the last few years is things are changing. And the question going forward is whether or not SSA is going to remain solely the domain of militaries into the future. And if not, then what does that relationship look like? What does the role look like between, because the national security element is not going to go away. That'll always be there. But the question becomes, what might the other roles be, and how might these other communities contribute to making it better for everybody? So I have an excellent panel with me today. To my immediate left, Lieutenant Colonel Travis Blake. He's a program manager with DARPA in the TTO office, engineering background, and a career working on engineering and science and technology to support the Air Force as well as the intel community. And relevant to this discussion, he's been doing quite a bit of work recently on pushing the envelope on how we can use off-the-shelf hardware and perhaps some innovation to really advance sensor technology and how that might actually contribute to SSA. Sitting next to him is Andrew Duva, President of Providence Access, a lawyer by training, but his expertise really goes much further than that. Over the last few years, he's been deeply involved with the satellite industry and the government on policy and strategy for SSA, and has been a key player in the formation and success of the Space Data Association, which is a new actor in the space field and is an important actor when it comes to SSA. And next to him is Dr. Paul Nielsen, Director and President of Software Engineering Institute. His expertise and background is in software development, cybersecurity, architectures, interoperability, and relevant to this discussion was a member of the recent National Research Council study on astrodynamic standards and how those impact the ability to do SSA. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Bruce Chesley, Director of Advanced Space Intelligence Systems for Boeing Phantom Works, another engineer by training, distinguished career in the Air Force, and is now leading a variety of programs at Boeing to develop smaller satellites and next-gen systems support a host of national security customers. Probably the best way to put that. I've come up with a question for each of them to get the discussion started. So we're going to begin with those, and then I'll start going to the discussions that you all are going to be texting in. I think I'm going to start with Andrew and discuss how can satellite operators contribute to SSA? What role do they play, and why is it important to have that relationship between the government's tracking debris and the satellite operators?
Okay, thanks, Brian. And it's great to be here again and quickly get lost in the technical discussions that I don't understand. But let me bring the business and commercial viewpoint to this important discussion. The benefit of going on the last panel is that you probably won't catch any mistakes that I make, but I have had the benefit of listening to everybody today. And so, long way of answering your question. It's very, very interesting to hear Dr. Austin from aerospace talk about some of the challenges that are faced here, and to have her say that there's still innovation possible in this area. I was encouraged to hear that, because I think the commercial industry, by definition, has to innovate. That's what they do, is they take established things, do a little bit of innovation, and try to, they take risk, and hopefully they get reward for risk. In the SSA area, which I think for commercial satellite operators includes more than collision avoidance, but also includes management, not only of the physical environment, but the RFI environment as well. These companies who have invested billions of dollars in assets are thinking about how to protect those assets and the environment in which they operate. And so there were comments throughout the day that seemed to suggest, and they were from a military perspective, that commercial industry might not be as concerned about some of the larger issues that a military or government might be. And I'm going to disagree with that. I think that the preservation of the environment is essential, and that folks have thought about that. And they are intensive users of the environment. Just to take one example of how industry both contributes and complicates the SSA picture, think of Intelsat. Intelsat is a GEO satellite operator. It's commercial now. They operate 77 satellites in GEO orbit. They perform 25,000 maneuvers per year. And they perform as well approximately 370,000 ranging operations to determine where their satellites are located on an annual basis, using 2 or more stations. So they have a pretty good idea of where they are and where they're going. Collision avoidance is important for them, and the way that they actually are a contributing sensor. They're very interested in staying away from hazards. So the challenge for them is how do they use that information and combine it with other information. And I think it was, I'm trying to check who was asking this. It was, I would have said it was Colonel Blake, but he's here. It wasn't him. Somebody said it was about getting it done and not just talking about it. And so the policy is great, and getting it done means bringing together data and using it. And commercial is generating lots and lots of data, and it relies absolutely on the space surveillance network and the products that the JSPOC puts out, which have improved tremendously over the years. But that's just looking backwards, right? What we were talking about predictive activity. And so what commercial wants to do is not only think about where they are, but they want to know that when they take an action, for example, take a maneuver, that maneuver is low risk. So their response to that was to develop, some of them, was to develop the Space Data Association and the Space Data Center in conjunction with AGI that actually runs the Space Data Center, and they set up a norm. Frank Rose talked about norms, establishing norms. One of the most important norms, and it doesn't apply to government users, but the commercial and civil participants in the SDA, and that includes NASA's robotic missions, NOAA, EUMETSAT, and 23 or so commercial operators, 300 or so satellites, have signed up to a new norm. And the new norm is you have to plan your maneuvers, and you have to deconflict those against known debris before you execute the maneuver. It sounds like not a big deal, but it's actually an incredibly big deal. It's the only control on operations. Richard Tremaine Smith from the UK mentioned that all of these satellite operators operate under government control and supervision and control, and that's an obligation of the states. And he's right, but as a lawyer with 20-odd years of experience in international satellite licensing, I can tell you I'm not familiar with a single government that actually legislates and controls how commercial operators operate in space. They don't. Most of them wouldn't know how to do it. The few that do, which would include the ones in this room, they don't. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? I don't know why it is, but I do know that so this is a long way of saying, Brian, your question proceeds from a false assumption. It's not commercial or government, and where should it be? We're in it together. We're going to stay within it together because of the nature of the environment and the licensing and the actors. There's simply no way for a commercial operator to completely disengage itself from being a representative of its launching state. So we have to figure out how to solve it together. So that's what I think we're going to do. Happy to take questions later.
Great, thank you very much. Travis, I think I'll turn to you now. Talk a bit about how sensor technology is changing, in particular some of the stuff going on in the commercial market, and how that impacts SSA.
Thank you, Brian. Also, thank everybody for making it to the end, and I would also say that your question starts from a false assumption. I'm Travis. I do congratulate everybody for making it to the end of the day, because the weather outside is horrible. And I do say that I am a huge fan of space lawyer jokes. So if you happen to have any more from last year, you're certain welcome to text them to Brian here. I'm sure he'll share the best of them. Maybe. So what's interesting, what we're doing at DARPA is we're really big into right now, and what we've seen DARPA us present over the last couple of conferences is a way to try to be somewhat sensor agnostic. So when you look at the ability to have better sensors, more complex sensors, that's all great. But what really it is it's about the data. And what we're trying to show is that the commercial, whether it is for money or a cooperative effort, because in lieu of money there's some other incentivating factor there to let two entities work together, we feel that we should be able to take that data in. Doesn't matter whether it comes from a commercial entity, a government sensor, a foreign partner sensor. We should be able to take that in and use it. And there's difficulties in being able to do that. But there's challenges and opportunities that come with that. The difficulty then comes is, what do you do with the combined data? And how does that feed back in? And that's somewhat of a different discussion. Bringing data in is a one-way transfer. Analyzing that data and then pushing that information back out, that's actually a little bit tougher question, and that's where the deeper partnerships kind of have to come in, and there's got to be some mutually beneficial reason to be able to do that. So with the response to the sensors, as a technology organization, we're always chasing the next best sensor. Everything is always a little bit better. Everybody comes in and says, well, I can beat that one. That's the way that technology advances. And what we're trying to do is set up a framework where it's easy to be able to bring that in. If you got a good sensor, come talk to us. We'll be happy to try to figure out what we can do to bring that into the network. And we're very, very interested in trying to do so such that at least the United States government doesn't own it. Because while it's nice to own something, it tends to cost a lot of money. And as everybody is aware of today with the questions this morning, that's one thing that the government does not have as much of as it used to. So we're trying to be a little more judicious and efficient with the way that that money is spent. So we'll be happy as the panel progresses to talk about how we're hoping to leverage commercial and civil within the R&D framework and to bring that forward. And I would say that I think the R&D, whether that's government R&D or other R&D, is in a unique position to try to press forward with these commercial and foreign partnership relationships. Because it's actually relatively easy for me to set up a R&D relationship with a foreign country or an R&D relationship with a commercial organization to prove out a concept. Much easier to do that than to have somebody operational try to plow that ground. So that's something that we're very interested in being able to do.
Great, thank you very much. So let's see if I can go 3 for 3 for deliberately false presumption questions. Paul, talk a bit about the hardware and software side of this, more the software side of things, and how some of what's going on in the private, IT sector is impacting SSA. And maybe, 1 year on from the NRC study, how has things changed and what's been done and what might still be, waiting in the wings a bit?
Well, that's a really good question. Not misleading at all. Complex question, though, with a lot of different pieces and parts.
Yeah.
Well, first off, I want to comment on something Travis said because I think it was very important, and that's that we really want to build systems that have the capacity and capability to evolve into the future. We don't want to build a new system every year. We've shown that we can't do that. In the case of SPADOC, we can't do a new one every 30 years, it seems, So we want to build systems that have some legs on them and can evolve. One of the things that means is that you want to have systems that don't have sort of government proprietary only interfaces to sensors. You want to take advantage of the information that's out there, and you don't even know all the information that's going to be out there 5 years, 10 years from now. So you want to build systems that can really take in all that information. Right now, to get closer to your question, on the hardware software side, it's really an interesting time, I think, because while we see the while we see the hardware in systems, it's largely the software that's making the systems work, giving them their individual characteristics, making them do and come alive the way that they do. So we're in an era where, like it or not, we're generally software driven. Software gives us a lot of flexibility, but we've also shown that it's a hard thing to manage sometimes, and we don't always do it so well. Software, when done right, though, when architected right, offers so many advantages. And there's example after example of how the commercial world has often done this really splendidly. Google has worked scaling to a fairly well. They in their basic concept, as they were developing all their algorithms, they were thinking of scale, and how they can do this at a larger and larger level. And so while we think of the government doing things at scale, Google does great things at scale. When you look at the iPad that lots of us have here today, it's so nice that you can add all those apps and, sort of like adding new sensors to it, right? And it's not an accident. Really thoughtful engineering went into building that operating system. And so one of my pet crusades is that in government systems, we have to think pretty hard about the architecture at the very beginning of the system. And to realize that no matter what the requirements say, one of the key requirements is that the system be able to evolve in time, because that's the way systems are. We don't want to throw out the good work we've done in the past. We want to evolve and build upon the good work we've done. That's the way to really exponentiate capabilities. So I see us entering a phase right now where the software is going to be extremely important. It's going to get to be even more important. And we're going for things at scale, evolving with time, that we couldn't do any other way. They're going to be so complex. Now, with respect to the NRC study, boy, when you do one of those studies, even as you go into it, you wonder, is anybody going to pay attention to it after it's published? Or is it going to become something on the coffee table? I think as studies go, this one has had some attention, and people are listening somewhat. I don't want to give anybody a big head and say they've done everything perfectly, because I don't think they have yet. But I think they are listening and trying to evolve. The government itself, as we all know, is a pretty ponderous ship, and it's hard for the government to change. It's hard for each of us to change. Try giving up smoking, try going on a diet, it's hard to change. So the government's going to have a hard time changing, and the government claims it wants to be agile, and I think in its heart, it really wants to be more agile, more nimble, to be able to do things faster, quicker, leaner. But that involves real change. It involves change in the way the government assigns programs, the way it manages programs, the way it oversees programs, and that's hard. That's culture. That's hard. When we talk to people in OSD, and some of us do, and they talk about having more agile programs, you say, well, how about these milestone decisions? Are you going to keep those? Well, yeah. Ooh, well, now how are you going to do that and be an agile program that changes its requirements every couple of months or weeks? So I think we still have some real challenges, and that plays back into the NRC study on JMS and other things. We want JMS to be one of those agile systems that can evolve in time, that has a smart operating system that can take in data from all kinds of sources, all kinds of data, and that can then give out data. Obviously it's got to be coordinated in a way, but to serve the broader community, because SSA is no longer just a military thing. It's a thing for the whole space community.
Thank you very much. And last but definitely not least, Bruce, there was some discussion earlier about, opinions that there wouldn't be a role for commercial industry in providing SSA. And so I'd like to give you a chance to maybe address that a little bit and talk about what you see it as a commercial private company, what maybe some opportunities are and some of the challenges.
Sure, okay. Yeah, it is certainly speculative at this point because there's not a robust market for commercial providers to offer SSA data, but I think Doug Lavero talked this morning about, the birth of the FAA maybe as a model, but I think there may be lots of things that could be a model for how the SSA evolves into a commercial marketplace where at least some supporting data is coming from commercial entities. Another model certainly that's been mentioned here is commercial imaging. There is maybe a model that looks at satellite communications. 80% of military satellite communications today are over leased commercial services, and then the government provides its own services for critical wideband and protected communications and so on. So there's a number of models, and I think it's too early to tell what, I guess maybe another model is, sort of a private security guard, right? The local authorities don't necessarily have the resources to monitor, this hotel or your corporate premises or whatever. So you hire a private security guard. If something happens, then they call the appropriate authorities. So there's a number of models out there that could take shape, and I think there are certainly some challenges with all of those. There's technical challenges, challenges in the sensor area, getting the right phenomenology. There's problems, and then getting that sensor data into the network, as Travis talked about, right? It's got to have the right formats. It's got to have the right data integrity. It's got to have the right security associated with it. But there's also policy challenges. The policy, as it was discussed earlier today, supports the creation of commercial entities to do that, but that doesn't necessarily fall out in a linear way. There's still some policy questions about, how could the government commit to a future business entity, during a development phase, and there, multi-year commitments of government funding and future commitments for things that don't exist are difficult, not necessarily impossible, but difficult. And it's a two-way street, right? Is the government going to commit to something that may not be there in the future? What if this corporate entity goes out of business and you're counting on it, right? So that it's not clear one way or the other. There's risk on both sides. So I think I think the policy issues there, and then there's business issues. What is the business case for entering into that kind of a service? It's a place that doesn't exist today, a marketplace that doesn't exist today, and commercial satellite operators, they have broad interests, but they're not interested in the full picture. They're interested in protecting their sort of narrow commercial interests. But when they need the data, they absolutely need it, and so so maybe there's a more sparse demand from commercial operators. So there's definitely a lot of challenges out there, and certainly if you think of hosted payload arrangements, those are complex business deals. How does a SATCOM operator get compensated for giving up transponders in order to host an SSA sensor? We've worked through some of those deals in Boeing, and they're complicated. But nevertheless, I still think there's some opportunities there, right? There's opportunities for new partnerships. There's opportunities for new business models, for information sharing, for data exploitation and integration. And really, I think in a couple of years when we're sitting here at this forum, we'll see that the creativity and ingenuity of the marketplace will offer some of those kinds of services. I think that's not too far in the distant future.
Great. Thank you very much. So now turning to some of the questions that have been submitted, a follow-up to a point you just made, and I'll throw that to whoever wants to answer it. Talk about the role of potential hosted payloads in SSA. Hosted payloads have become almost kind of a buzzword of the last couple of years as the government is thinking about how can we get our stuff on orbit without necessarily having to buy the whole satellite or own the whole launch. And space surveillance, SSA certainly would probably fit into that. Does anyone want to take that question as to what some of the, what might that look like, and is that something the commercial operators are maybe interested in hosting?
I'll try.
Sure.
So hosted payload can mean a lot of things to a lot of different operators. But ultimately what it means is that you're going to have multiple missions, or you're going to have the spacecraft have sensors maybe for your primary mission where the data are used in non-traditional ways for secondary missions. I do think it can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. The challenge with working with the government on hosted payloads for commercial operators is generally one of timely delivery and integration. And so either your GFE is going to get there on time and get integrated and get launched, or it might not, and requirements creep on the government side. Commercial is pretty agile in doing the trades, and certainly are able to evaluate what the change to the return on invested capital might be if you have to downsize your main mission or alter its life. So I think that's the case of adding a sensor. What I've seen recently, say the last 2 or 3 years, is that there's very serious interest in at least the large commercial operators in putting SSA type sensors on their spacecraft. And this is not for a government. This is for them. This is for them looking to get a better understanding of the environment, whether it's star sensors or detecting solar weather. We just see that this is something that they're going to do. So I think we're going to see that. And then the question for this community is, well, with all that data being collected and maybe used for one purpose, how can we find ways to best use that data for our shared interests? And that's the same thing with the SDA concept I mentioned earlier. Tons of data out there, all in, and this I'm just in commercial and civil, all in silos, not being combined. If it was combined, you could discern patterns. You could do some threat and warning stuff from a military perspective. You could understand SSA better. But until we use that data, we're not going to get that. So I think we're going to see a lot of it.
So a couple different questions have come in that have asked about what's the possibility of there being a market for SSA data. And to kind of frame the question, I will define market as the classic many buyers and many sellers. And to start things off, and my personal take is that I do not foresee a market per se, especially in low Earth orbit, because there aren't a lot of commercial activities going on in low Earth orbit. It's mainly governments operating satellites in low Earth orbit for the most part. And so then you get into not necessarily a market per se, but more of a contractor relationship. But I may be wrong. I'm happy to throw that to anybody else who wants to tackle that question. Anybody?
Well, I say, so one of the things that we've looked at with Oceanit, who's in the audience here, is this concept of a consumer supplier and actually a broker in between that's able to provide the consumer and put the consumer and supplier together. And they've done an absolutely fabulous job of actually simulating that kind of environment. Now, what we have found through our programs is that there actually isn't really much of a shortage of suppliers. Many people in this audience, many people that will be in the audience for the rest of the week, have approached us with the ability to provide space domain awareness data to the global picture. So the supplier side seems to be somewhat fairly well set. But the question is on the consumer side, how many consumers of the data are there? And that's where we kind of struggle, and that's where the simulations have some, that's where they start to diverge from reality, is because if we have a lot of consumers, the market does really well, and you have a very robust, and you can actually drive down prices. But when you only have one buyer, it becomes very difficult. We seem to be on an iPad theme here today. I got Brian up here next to me playing Candy Crush on his iPad. But you can imagine a market where there's lots of tablet providers, there's lots of people wanting to buy tablets, and so the market works itself out. But if there's lots of tablet providers and there's only one person that's capable of buying one, then all of a sudden the dynamics really are much, much different. We've struggled with this. We've tried to, hypostulate, what could be different markets. It turns out that, when the United States government buys something, it's not really kosher to then sell it to a different part of the government. The government usually buys something once. And when we do foreign partnerships, data exchange is usually part of that partnership. So if we have a partnership with another country, selling to both countries doesn't really, fit the bill either. There potentially is with commercial, though. And that's the one thing that we've kind of left open there, is that, you certainly could see the ability to sell data to a commercial company who might be interested in the local awareness around their satellites of interest, and then also supplying that same set of data to the government for a global set of interest. But even then, I don't know that you're running up against a rich consumer set. And that's where things start to kind of break down. So we do have the simulations for that. And if you guys can bring the consumer market, we certainly can bring the analysis for that market.
And Travis, do you think it would almost have to be a new type of data or a higher fidelity data than we currently provide?
It's got to be something.
Yeah.
It's got to be
Have some
something
extra
beyond
value.
just what, the current kind of track.
Right.
So I'm holding out hope that, there is a
Yeah.
different set of questions that will require a different set of answers.
Yeah.
And that we can find some kind of more discontinuous sets so that, we can actually have one supplier being able to, sell their product to more than one consumer. Because again, if you develop one thing and you only can sell it once, a market that does not make.
I know last year in our study, one of the things we said was lacking from the current database of data provided was real true covariance data. So owner-operators could understand how accurate the data was, whether they should act on it or not.
Yep.
And maybe that's one of those things that could be an added value.
You certainly could see each owner-operator in that scenario
Yeah.
being able to, provide that market-based approach, which does have some validity to it.
Yeah.
But then you start to look at that next level of, well, how much data will that one owner-operator buy, and would that also then support a marketplace? So
Right.
it's just it's a tough scenario to try to get into. That's where this analysis of the overhead imagery from commercial systems and, looking down versus looking up is quite different. There is a robust market for, well, robust is, I guess, a relative term. There is a market for, images taken from space. I mean, one news organization buys an image, that same image can then be sold to other news organizations, so there is something to that, where that is not the same analogy in the SDA world.
There's a question here about SSA, though. Certain kinds of SSA might very well develop into commercial products. For example, knowledge of the electromagnetic environment can be used for mission planning and system optimization. So getting that data and processing it might lead to a product that we might have a commercial input. Think about GPS. GPS data is free, and yet of course, there are a massive number of value-added applications. So I'm wondering, the other thing that's free is weather. Weather data is free. And yet, folks, there are specialized weather companies that develop advanced forecast and analysis. So those kind of things, I think,
Could be.
There probably is some essential public, let's call it public function here, whether it's military or government, on just providing data, and then my guess is markets will spring up, but I do not think that to answer Brian's question, I do not think there's going to be a commercial market for example, there's not going to be a commercial geodes.
Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent point, which pains me to tell a lawyer that. So, and I would suggest too that the weather data and GPS data are not free. They are paid for by your tax dollars.
As is the SSN.
They're public goods provided by
public goods.
government, right?
But I think you're onto a very interesting point there, and something that I think I will be talking to Scott in the back as he's furiously writing down. One of the things that we might want to look at is instead of approaching this, supplier consumer broker model from a data perspective, look at it from a product perspective. Because then you actually, as I start to think about it here, then you actually can see the multiple selling of data, because that same data can be used in different derived information products.
It's like an aftermarket.
And I can see Scott in the back right now sending an email back home, looking at them to look at them.
Is sort of a subscription model, right? And so you could sell subscriptions to a variety of different levels of service, right? You might need minute by minute updates, or you might just need a once a month sort of an update. And so it might derive from the same sensor, but you could,
And I think
perhaps
this
send that.
gets back to what General Nielsen saw. I mean, it certainly, if a company was looking to do that, having these open software architectures that allow them to have the agility I would think that, a business that was in this for the profit of it would live and die by the ability for it to be agile. When an SDA or somebody came in and says, okay, now I want to know this.
We can do that.
It was not measured on JMS timescales, but it was measured on literally, okay, give us a day and we'll be kicking out your new data product. And that was actually something that was in the simulations that we were running, was kind of almost there's a secondary data market, so that you have the data supplier, but what really resides on top of that is really an information supplier. So in that case, if you do that, then you still can start looking at a market, because each data supplier could now have a market of different information suppliers to sell that same piece of data to. And then the consumers, they would have a choice of which information supplier to be able to go to. So if Intelsat wanted to know a certain piece of information, there could be several different information suppliers that could meet that. And underneath that, there may be several different data suppliers. So in that case, the beauty about that is it gets the government out of the way. I mean, you can then contract directly with the data supplier that you would need.
So changing it up a little bit, a couple more questions here, asking about what are some of the challenges from the commercial perspective in working with governments. And so questions that talk about liability, and I think Bruce mentioned earlier uncertainty. So does anyone want to elaborate on
Yeah,
some of those
I'll take
challenges?
that one. I think the government's very easy to work with.
Anybody not in the government want to take that question?
Sure, I'll take that. The government's easy. Look, the government's easy to work with if you are willing to work on government timetables and with government rules. And it depends which government we're talking about. Okay, some governments are really easy to work with, as a commercial guy saying that. Some governments, U.S., require a different approach, and the approach requires an understanding that the government is not agile and that sometimes it makes markets by its decisions, particularly in procurement. So it has, you've got to deal with a lot of rules, and you've got to deal with folks who are under a lot of scrutiny in terms of the government officials. And so it's a big organization, takes a lot of time. If you can do that, you can succeed, but it gets very hard. One private practice note I'd say, I advise a lot of companies who want to sell things to the government, services generally. And they come to me and they say, well, I have a new service and I want to sell it to, the DOD. And I said, okay, tell me about your next 4-year plan. And they said, we don't understand. We're ready now. We want to sell it tomorrow. I said, no, we're going to talk about the next 4 years, because it's going to take you 1 or 2, unless you've got something that is going to save lives in a combat situation, you're going to need a couple of years to get the sale done. And that's just the reality. It's a shame, because some good ideas don't get picked up for that reason, but it is difficult. I don't know how to solve it.
Well, it's especially true in the big formal acquisition system, but maybe not so true in the S&T organizations of the government.
That's true.
Which have somewhat faster acquisition cycles. They still don't have really fast ones, but they have somewhat faster. And the whole ideas that were started many years ago of BAAs and things like that leave things a little open, so good ideas can come in and can be acted on a little bit quicker. I think in many ways the Defense Department S&T organizations have been a strong foundation for S&T work, basic research and applied research in the physical sciences and engineering. And there aren't many other sources of that kind of funding in the U.S. today. When you get into the bio world, there's a lot of other kind of sources, that kind of play that bio and medical world. And when you get in some of the commercial computer and software worlds, there's some other sources, a lot of self-funding that goes on there. But for hardcore physical sciences and engineering, DoD's often been it.
Yeah, I'll just take a reattack. I think that's right. For developmental items or technologies, the government may be your only market. And that's part of their role, right? For selling, my example was the technology is ready, the service is ready. I just want to, I've got something that works commercially. How do I sell to the government? And the answer is it's going to take you some time.
Yeah. The government still does take on some pretty audacious things too. It takes on some projects that are pretty huge. And I think all of us are proud of what JPL's done with some of those missions to Mars, and you think, wow, that is really neat. Yeah. That may not have been something a commercial organization would have taken on, with the risk, with the time scales, with the money that needed to be invested. And more recently, what our audacious goal, NSA's PRISM program, that's pretty audacious.
Seems to be pretty agile too, and be able to suck in data from all sources, So there's a question here that I think we've already touched on, but it may be worthwhile just going deliberately. Do we foresee a commercial entity developing an independent SSA capability that is outside of what's provided by various militaries? And is that something that could exist, or are there things that are preventing it probably from happening?
Yes.
Well, I think Andrew touched on that. I think there's, certainly commercial operators are looking at understanding their own environment and doing sort of a self-service. And I think that might be a way that you see something like that spring up.
Self and cooperative.
Yeah, and then a cooperative venture evolving out of that. Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you an example that's very real for the commercial SATCOM environment. Within the Space Data Association, one of the 3 key missions is EMI RFI mitigation. The way that the commercial operators who fund SDA are approaching that is to set up machine-to-machine connections with the Space Data Center to contribute state information about their fleets, what the transponder loading looks like, what the connectivities are on transponded satellites, et cetera, so that you can build a network map. And if you have to find an interfering signal and you want to do an interferometric geolocation, rather than having to, call everybody, get the exact satellite location and find your wanted and good satellites, you can just query the database and feed your geolocation gear and start the solution process. That's not something that, despite, by the way, I can tell you multiple requests of the U.S. government, that the U.S. government seems to have any interest in providing, even though they are highly reliant on those systems.
Yeah, and I guess the key piece of that is interference hits the operators right in the core of their business model, right?
That's right.
Anything that diminishes their ability to deliver data, it limits their ability to charge for that service. And so, so they're highly motivated to,
resolve that issue
to
fast.
resolve that fast, exactly, so
Or
they
avoid
can
it altogether.
maximize their investment in their on-orbit asset. And so, yeah, that's another great example.
Very good. So there was a brief mention a bit earlier that there may be a public good aspect to SSA, government providing that. And there's a question here, so what is the responsibility of governments to then share that data if it is being thought of in a public good aspect? Is there a responsibility there and to public safety, and what might that entail?
I'll take that.
Sure.
I have an opinion. And the opinion is, let's take a look at navigation. Okay, coastal navigation. There are aids to navigation. Hazards are marked. The governments, I think it is all governments now, put buoys out. They put up lighthouses. They issue NOTAMs. It's about safety. And so, people are up here talking, the last panel was talking about classification and objects that aren't acknowledged. Okay, let's take that off the table. Those are different objects, but there's debris. And not releasing information on debris, I think, is a mistake. Maybe there has to be some controls on the quality of the information that's released to avoid giving away capabilities that could be security sensitive. I don't know. You guys all know. But I think that data has to be pushed out for safety, if nothing else.
I agree, Andrew, and I think, in the air case, you can make a case for the air above your country being sovereign airspace, but in the outer space case, we all operate through it all the time, and so it's more of an international asset, really. So I think you're right.
Well, and to kind of build on that analogy, a fundamental aspect of the air traffic regime, which was mentioned earlier this morning, is the concept of due regard. So the air traffic rules and the air traffic governance framework applies to non-state aircraft. And state aircraft are only required to operate with due regard to all the others. And it's a very interesting concept for getting around this issue. And that, the air traffic system does not attempt to control military aircraft activities. It just controls everything else, and it lets the state aircraft operate as they wish, and 99 times out of 100, they follow the rules, even though they're not mandated to, because that's what's in the best interest. And when following those rules is not in compliance with what they need to do for their national security objective, they don't. And I think it's an interesting potential framework to think about when it comes to SSA moving forward.
Yeah, the other piece of that is that requires some deliberate planning on the part of the government to say where those lines are going to be with respect to what is in the public interest and what is going to be reserved as a government-only function. And thinking back to the early days of GPS, the government announced for many years that, hey, the course acquisition code is going to be available for anybody to provide value-added services, and this whole marketplace sprang out of that. And so that was the rules of the road were clear, so nobody was relying on the P code that wasn't going to be available to build the foundation of their business plan, for example.
Right. And we're almost there, right? If you look at space track, in terms of the data that the U.S. does release, they do release data on a number of cataloged objects, debris objects. I think they still have a warning on space track that says the data are not sufficient for CA.
Yep.
So again, maybe we should make the data sufficient for CA, and that would be a really big step.
That would be.
Yeah.
A question that was brought up earlier on the previous panel in terms of, well, we're already getting all this data from the JSPOC, so we're good. Andrew, is that something that the commercial operators kind of buy into?
No, and you know the answer. Of course, it's not good. It's good, but it's not good enough, right?
Yeah.
This is not a knock on the JSPOC, okay? I always get accused, like, I don't actually, but the commercial does. Let's be clear, the JSPOC's limitation today in this area is that they are looking at what is or what was, not what will be. And the reason they can't look at what will be in the best possible way is that the systems that they have today, not JMS increment 2 or whatever, the systems they have today do not routinely incorporate maneuver data, anticipated maneuvers. And so at least for commercial operators that want to deconflict based on maneuver data, which within the SDA they do, they have to use a combination of information systems, right? So SDA does not have access to the best debris data because it's not available outside a government channel. The government has access because every responsible space operator that's commercial is happy to give to any government its maneuver data in advance. But most governments, I think probably all, they can't use it. So we have this situation of we haven't found a way yet to fuse and use the best data. It's not that folks from both commercial, civil, and government, and military government are not desperately trying, in good faith, I have to say, to solve that problem. But today, right now, we are not there. But there are people who are trying. And I hope we get there.
That was something that the NRC study hit last year, is that even if you said the JSPOC met the requirements it was supposed to meet, it wasn't going to meet the demand for requirements in the future that we could see coming. People were going to need a better quality product, and as more and more commercial units are in space, we knew that the demand for this is just going to increase pretty quickly. And so you almost you can't build to a static point. You have to look to where the ball's going to be, where the puck's going to be, and kind of build to the future right now.
Especially if you're thinking in, geologic timelines.
30 years.
Right?
Yeah.
30 years ago.
So there's a question here that touches on a number of points that we've raised, and that's, do we need an FAA for space? And what that translates into, I think, is the current model is that the operational side of the military, not the S&T side, but the operational side, is the lead actor for SSA, for cooperation, for sharing, providing that data. I think what this question is getting at is that the right model going forward? Because some comments have been made earlier about how we need to have systems that evolve, perhaps continuously, agility, take advantage of data from many sources, including those we don't own. I'm not sure if the operational arm of the military is an organization that I would feel comfortable entrusting all those sorts of characteristics to.
It's early days for an FAA, right? I mean, we don't have a space traffic surveillance system. We don't have a set of rules and norms. We have a few, but very few, and we have no legally binding international framework on the use of space. as Paul said, it's an international regime, not a national airspace regime. So there are a lot of policy issues you'd have to cross. Do I think, could we get there? Yeah, we could get there, but it wouldn't be an FAA. It would be something else that would be international, multinational in character.
So this is where I put my disclaimer on that I do not represent the United States government or the Air Force or any other agency besides myself at this point. So it's my personal opinion that I think something like that needs to occur. Whether it is a federal organization that cooperates with federal organizations and other countries, whether it is part of the UN, or something like that. And the reason I believe this is I will put on my warfighting hat that they allow me to wear for a couple hours a year. It's my belief that the reason that needs to exist is because the JSPOC does not do the military job that it's supposed to do. It's not supposed to be the traffic management. It's supposed to be the center that tells decision makers that military systems are under threat and something needs to be done about it. And the problem right now is if you spent any time in the JSPOC, they're all good people, they're all great citizens, they're all great warfighters, whether they're US, Canadian, Allied, et cetera, but they're so focused on the here now and really what just happened that they cannot focus on what they really should. And it is just a fundamental different mentality to look at what the JSPOC does versus what an other AOC, Maritime Ops Center, or something else does. And one of the things we tried to press to our senior leaders at DARPA is space is not different. There's differences. Certainly there's challenges in operating in the space environment, but I'm pretty sure if you go over to the Navy, they'll tell you there's severe challenges at operating at extreme depths in the oceans as well. So there's differences, but it really shouldn't be as a domain treated that special as it's been treated so far. So I've been a real trying to push, taking that part over to some other agency. And I certainly concur. I understand the challenges there. I understand the policy implications, but they are just that. They're policy implications. There was a comment earlier that, one of the problems is that there's not as much sensing as there needs to be in order to maybe support an organization like that. I think that actually can be overcome. I don't think that's necessarily the limitation. And one of those differences in the space environment is Kepler works for you. That given understanding, you can predict where something's going to be. That's not necessarily true of aircraft. Right. If everything's go correctly, the aircraft shows up where it's supposed to be. But as anybody who has flown in the past day or two, you can probably know that aircraft don't always end up where they're supposed to be at the time they're supposed to be there. That might be an instance where space actually has an advantage. So I think that can be overcome, but I approach it from the warfighter perspective because it will then allow me to get the tools into the JSPOC for them to do the actual military indications and warning mission that I think they should be doing.
And this discussion really points to the need for a strong civil component, right? We've talked about the military component, which is obviously the main mover in this whole mission area. We've talked about commercial, we've talked about R&D. We haven't said anything about civil, and yet that seems to be a strong need for this area as it evolves, if it's really going to meet the needs of all of those various entities.
Well, I can say as someone who had some input into, the organization, this panel and the people, we made an attempt to get some people from some civil agencies to perhaps try and contribute, and that was a very difficult ask. Partly because there's, this is an interagency question, partly because there's a lot of undecided things. So we recognize that. But that is an excellent point, is there a civil component to this, and what does that look like, and how does that work with the other components? So there's a question here that it was answered, what would the needs be in the future? And the question is, what would a couple more collision events or a collision event in geo change the game? How would that impact these? Would it really change things, or would it just make it more important that we improve some of these capabilities?
Kind of depends on what collision happens, right?
Yeah, you could see it evolving a couple different ways. You could see, commercial providers going their own way, right? If they didn't feel like they were getting adequate warning information, that really might drive that market to go do something on its own as a way to manage their own risk.
You could also see a collision with a national military system driving it the other way. That all of a sudden, the JSPOC is now completely and utterly and totally focused
Right.
on.
That's what I was
on
thinking. It
collision
depends
avoidance.
what type of collision happens. Or,
You could also see a lasting damage to the environment.
right.
And the economic impacts. Or, to put it in warfighting terms, I mean, say some orbital slots become not usable over certain key regions. You might become very constrained in what you're able to do there.
And you bring up an interesting point. So at DARPA, we get a lot of questions about space debris. We've gotten many proposals on lasers. We understand the benefits and limitations of those. What's interesting is a lot of those, most of the proposals we see come in with a lot of good technical ideas and very little actual consequence analysis. So they want to remove a piece of debris. Okay, well, there's 100,000 of those up there. Why would removing one make any difference? We have yet to find something that would be able to be a substantial reduction, such that when you consider it in total, you didn't actually, everybody wants to go grab a piece of debris and bring it down.
Right.
Okay, that's great, but how do you ensure you're not going to cause one of those collisions?
Right.
So in total, we haven't found that solution yet, but one of the things you just mentioned kind of spurred the thought is everybody says, okay, well, what should you do about it? And one of the things that we're trying to advocate is go ahead and start operating in some of those orbital regimes where debris is not so prevalent. You know what, move up higher. There are some, you trade a debris problem now for a total ionizing dose problem. But, that's the nature of technology. You trade off something that's hard to do with something you can do. So, it's kind of one of those that, we have lots of good established norms now for, kind of cleaning up after yourself in the debris environment. So, why don't we start over and we'll keep this environment clean and something like that. So, it's a tough challenge, but it is one that that DARPA is willing to take on to look at debris mitigation. So if anybody happens to have an actually realistic idea that will do something for the total reduction in the probability of collision, we're certainly interested in hearing about that.
Yes.
Commercial, civil, military, foreign, we are completely agnostic. So.
I guess the underlying premise of the question is sort of troubling, right? The premise is things are so screwed up, it's going to take some collisions in order to drive some action to make the situation better.
Well, that's what we saw, right?
Yeah.
I'll just say commercially, that's what we saw. We saw Iridium Cosmos caused the U.S. government entities responsible for looking outward about SSA data and services to really step up their game and engage. Until that time, I was involved personally, the level of interest was a lot lower. So I think we're just it's a reality of our process,
Yes.
at least in the U.S.
Yes, indeed.
So Travis, my concern about that is there's an episode of The Simpsons where they use the town as a landfill, and eventually gets to the point where they just move the whole town 2 miles down the road to avoid the problem.
Yeah. We'll go to another planet.
And so, yes, yes, we can certainly maybe use some different orbits. I think if we don't change the behaviors before we go to do that.
Certainly, I think the behaviors have to be changed, but the cleaning up of the environment is where the challenge is. So, you know what? There's lots and lots of space out there. We use a fraction of what's actually out there, and we certainly could use a lot more of it if you chose to.
How many trillion cubic miles did Wanda mention?
It's 5,000 times the volume of the Earth ocean.
Yes.
So there's lots of space.
So as we wrap up here, another question came in, and Travis, maybe you want to tackle this one. Why not have a competition for SSA ideas? like there has been for launch or for space access with various X prizes, that sort of a thing? Has that been thought about?
Yeah, so, grand challenges and prizes have kind of gone out of vogue at DARPA. I think there was some history to that that I will speak to completely off the record and, some other venue where I'm not being taped. But in general, I think we've been told that we don't do prizes. Now, I will say that the general premise of the question, though, is kind of like, if there's a challenge out there, what can I do about it? DARPA has an open BAA that you are always welcome to solicit topics to. I'm sure my email is around someplace. If you do not know how to solicit to that, let me know. I will get you into touch with the people that know how to do that. The only other thing you have to remember is www.darpa.mil, and you can find the solicitation. If you just have an idea and you can submit a paragraph executive summary of what's interesting. We'll do an evaluation on that and see if you have an idea that's worth pursuing. So there's not a really high bar for entry into to getting your idea looked at. So in lieu of a challenge, you can create a self-challenge to be able to do something about this and solicit to at least our BAA. I'm sure there's other BAAs within the government that would be available to you as well.
Well, we only have a few minutes left, so I'll just open up for if any of you guys want to have any closing comments or remarks or words of wisdom before we all go get some Mai Tais.
Still haven't heard space lawyer joke.
Yeah, running out of time.
Yeah. They're all tapped out from last year.
Yeah, I think we had a winner. I'll say just a couple seconds. It seems to me that we, and by we I mean commercial, civil, military, intelligence, have to work this problem set together, and we have to do it outside the confines of a single government. It has to be, multinational, multilateral, multi-actor. That's the reality we're living in. I know for some that that's a very uncomfortable concept. I know this because some of you talk to me and say, Andrew, you don't understand, this is why. And I've been working this problem now for about 7 years. I think I do understand. What I'd leave you with is it's clearly not a technical challenge, most of this. This is a process and culture challenge for all of us to figure out trust and the ways to work together. So I hope in a year or two when we come back, we're working together more closely.
And I hate to disagree with a lawyer, because that usually ends up in jail time. But I would say there are some technical challenges to that. I think at its core, the fundamentals of trying to work together, there are extreme policy implications. And, we mentioned the change. And, as humans, we tend to be stuck on what we feel comfortable with, and change is hard. But there are challenges, and I think you heard Mr. Olivero speak to some of those about, if, there is a sensor and data you want that's in a foreign country, it's not like you can just bring that data in. There's things that you have to do to be able to accept that in, to be able to use that data. There's security, and more importantly, there's verification, validation of those data sets. In an engineering sense, there's this thing that we call error. And those are prevalent in a lot of the data sets that we get in. We have to find a way to be able to deal with that. Then you go into the whole question of the standards and things like that. So there are some technical challenges. Now, are those challenges not able to be overcome? We believe they are. But, we have to be able to put the right research into place to be able to do that. And my last plug is that DARPA is fully committed to looking at, commercial, civil, foreign participation in space surveillance programs. We have a number of programs that are ongoing into this. We're always welcome more. So if you have a good idea, let us know.
Paul or Bruce?
Well, I was just thinking, Kennedy made the famous statement, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And some of the challenges that we're facing now are very hard challenges. The scale and scope of some of the engineering challenges we face are international. That brings in political kind of aspects. but it also brings in really tough engineering aspects to do these things at this scale and with this complexity. I think that's the challenge for our generation, is working on these really complex problems, and I think it's a challenge we'll take.
Yeah, and I think that's the key gauntlet to be thrown down to industry, right? Is the creativity and innovation of new business models. I think will surface in this arena as well as we've seen in others. So I think I think the door is open for innovation to find a way to take this government-dominated market with some government-funded R&D and how to springboard that into commercial opportunities. And I think that's one of the the great elements of American business, quite honestly, is that that challenge will be fulfilled somehow.
Great. And along those lines, I mean, the echo comment was made just a short time ago. Space has differences, but is not different. And that model and that approach has reaped pretty enormous benefits in many, many other sectors. And I don't see why it wouldn't also be the same for space. So round of applause, please, for the panelists.
Brian and the fellow panelists, I really want to thank you. I think this is quite a testament as you look out, from my perspective, our perspective, look out at the audience, and we have just as many people here now at 4 o'clock as we did at 8 o'clock this morning, or 8:30 this morning. I think our colleagues in the marketing world, they would have adjourned at 11 o'clock today, given this location. So it's a testament to the interest of the different panels. I want to, just a few thank yous to go around and a couple final housekeeping remarks. I especially want to thank about the 21 different speakers that came here on the panels today and had offered just tremendous insight from their different perspectives and their agencies and departments. I want to thank Peter, Mark, Audrey, and Brian for moderating these panels. I think they did an outstanding job of cultivating a lot of different personalities and taking all the questions that they got and as I said earlier, synthesizing some complex issues and offering them to the panel. I thought they did an excellent job. And I also want to thank all the participants who came today, the audience folks. I know people literally came from all over the world to be at this conference, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and some of the others. Special thanks to the Maui Economic Development Board for putting this on and bringing us all together. Jeannie and Sandy, your guys' team just did an outstanding job. I also want to thank Jamie Landers, who has been feeding a lot of these questions going up, but that's not all what Jamie did. I mean, she worked tirelessly with Sandy to make this happen and get all the right people together. So I want to thank that. I also want to thank my colleague Travis Langster, who I know was kind of the backbone behind this. Travis put out an internal challenge to us. He kind of leads all our SSA efforts. He put an internal challenge out to us that I think I should share with everyone before we adjourn to the reception tonight. And that was to go out and meet 10 new people that you haven't met or worked with before. And I've met my quota already, so I'm not maxed out, but I checked the block. But I think everyone should do that because there's outstanding, extremely intelligent people here, and I think we'd all benefit from that marketing of each other, of our assets, and the commerce that we can do together. Lastly, there's a reception tonight, 6 p.m. at the Luau Gardens. Follow the tiki lights if you don't know where that is, and Brian is buying Mai Tais for everyone, which is outstanding and very kind of him to do that. With that said, that concludes our policy. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow morning for the start of the AMOS conference.